It was the third Saturday of May, and Hargrove University was dressed for the occasion. The kind of dressed up that only happens twice a year, once for the fall convocation and once for graduation day. Banners in navy and gold stretched across the columns of the main hall. The lawn had been freshly cut, and the roses along the walkway were in full bloom, almost as if the campus itself had rehearsed. Families were arriving in waves, parents in their Sunday best, grandparents being helped out of cars, younger siblings running between legs, everyone buzzing with that particular electricity that only comes when something real has been earned. Inside the administration building, behind a heavy oak door with a brass nameplate that read, Director of Academic Events, a woman named Victoria Ashworth was having what she would later describe as the most important day of her career. She had been at Hargrove for 11 years, working her way up from an events coordinator to the director position she now occupied with considerable pride. Victoria was not a bad person in the way that villains in movies are bad. She was the more common kind, the kind that has spent so long protecting her status that she mistakes cruelty for competence. She was 43, sharp-dressed in a steel-gray blazer and heels that clicked on the marble floor with authority. She had a clipboard in one hand and a headset around her neck that she didn't actually need but wore anyway, because it made her look like someone who was in charge. And on this particular morning, she absolutely was in charge. The graduation ceremony for the class of 2024 was her event, her production, her achievement, and she was not going to let anything disrupt it. Which is exactly the mindset that makes people do terrible things. At approximately 9:45 in the morning, about an hour and 15 minutes before the ceremony was set to begin, a man arrived at the side entrance of the main hall. He was old, somewhere in his late 70s, maybe even 80, though it was hard to say precisely. He had a full head of white hair, neatly combed. He wore a suit that had clearly been expensive at some point, maybe 20 years ago, dark charcoal with faint pinstripes, slightly worn at the cuffs. He carried a wooden cane that he didn't lean on heavily, more like a habit than a necessity. His shoes were polished, his tie was straight. He had made an effort. His name was Walter Ellison. He walked slowly but steadily up to the check-in table near the side entrance, where two of Victoria's assistants were stationed. He gave his name. One of the assistants scrolled through the guest list on a tablet, frowned slightly, scrolled again, and then looked up with the kind of apologetic expression that means bad news is coming. His name wasn't on the list. Walter nodded calmly, as if this didn't particularly surprise him. He explained quietly and without any fuss that he had been personally invited by the university's outgoing president, Dr. Harold Finch, who was retiring after the ceremony. He and Dr. Finch had known each other for many years. He was certain there had simply been a clerical error. The assistant, a young woman named Priya, who would later feel genuinely awful about what happened next, asked him to wait one moment and went to find Victoria. Victoria came around the corner with her clipboard and her headset and looked at Walter the way some people look at a smudge on a window, aware of it, mildly annoyed, already thinking about something else. She asked him to explain the situation. He did, again, patiently, in the same measured and unhurried tone. He mentioned Dr. Finch by name. He mentioned that he'd driven over 2 hours to be here. He mentioned that he was certain it was simply an administrative oversight. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her clipboard. Then she looked back at him. "Sir," she said, "if your name isn't on the list, I can't let you in. We have very limited seating, and this event is for registered guests only. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." Walter said he understood, but perhaps someone could call Dr. Finch directly to confirm. Victoria said that Dr. Finch was preparing for the ceremony and could not be disturbed. Walter said he could wait. Victoria said that wasn't possible because the area needed to be cleared for arriving guests. And then, and this is the part that people who witnessed it still talk about, Victoria leaned slightly toward him, lowered her voice just enough that it felt like a confidence, but loud enough that 3 or 4 people nearby could hear, and said, "Sir, I don't know who told you that you were invited. But we deal with situations like this every year. People show up without credentials and expect to be let in because they have a story. I don't have time for stories today. Please leave before I have to involve security." There was a silence. Walter looked at her, not with anger, not with hurt. Just looked at her, the way someone looks at something they are filing away carefully in their memory. "Of course," he said. "I apologize for the inconvenience." And he turned. And he walked back out the side entrance, into the May sunshine, and got into a black car that had been waiting at the curb. Nobody watched him go. Victoria had already moved on to the next item on her clipboard. Here's what I'll say about this moment, and I'll keep it brief. There is a particular kind of arrogance that comes with temporary authority. Victoria wasn't the president of the university. She wasn't even close. She was the events director on a big day, which is a real job and a real responsibility. But it is not a license to humiliate a white-haired man in a pinstripe suit who drove 2 hours and polished his shoes for the occasion. The cruelty wasn't in the decision to enforce the guest list. That might have been technically justifiable. The cruelty was in the delivery, the implication that he was lying, that he was the kind of nuisance they deal with every year. That was chosen, that was gratuitous. And chosen cruelty has a way of circling back. The ceremony proceeded without incident. Dr. Finch gave his retirement address, a warm and slightly rambling speech about the importance of intellectual humility, which in retrospect feels almost too on the nose. Diplomas were handed out, photographs were taken, families cheered. The afternoon sun lit up the gold and navy banners, and everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. After the ceremony, Dr. Finch stood near the reception area shaking hands and accepting well wishes. At some point, one of his former colleagues approached him and mentioned, almost casually, that an older gentleman had shown up that morning and been turned away at the door. Said his name was Walter. Said Finch had invited him personally. Dr. Finch stopped smiling. "Walter Ellison?" he said. The colleague shrugged. "I think so. White hair, cane, charcoal suit?" Dr. Finch closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Who turned him away? The answer, it turned out, was Victoria Ashworth. Dr. Finch excused himself from the reception, found Victoria near the dessert table, and asked her, in the careful tone of a man trying very hard to remain composed, to explain what had happened. Victoria explained confidently that a man without credentials had arrived claiming to be a personal guest, that she had followed proper protocol, and that she had handled the situation professionally. Dr. Finch asked if she knew who Walter Ellison was. Victoria said she did not. Dr. Finch looked at her for a long moment. "Victoria," he said, "Walter Ellison is the reason this university exists." She laughed briefly, the way people laugh when they think someone is exaggerating for effect. "I'm sorry." "He's not just an old friend," Finch said. "He's the man who bought Hargrove in 2003 when it was about to be sold off and dissolved. He restructured the entire endowment. He rebuilt the science building. He funded the scholarship program that has put over 400 students through this institution who couldn't have afforded it otherwise. He stepped back from any public role 20 years ago because he said he didn't want the attention. And he's been a silent majority stakeholder ever since. Finch paused. He is, for all practical purposes, the owner of this university. And you told him he had a story. The color left Victoria's face in a way that was almost visible, like a light being turned off. I didn't know, she said. No, said Dr. Finch. You didn't. That night, Walter Ellison sat in the study of his home about 90 miles from Hargrove, in a house that was large but not ostentatious, surrounded by books and framed photographs and the particular quiet of a life well lived. He was not angry. He had not been angry, really, at any point during the day. He had been something else, thoughtful maybe, reminded of something he had perhaps half forgotten. He picked up his phone and made 2 calls. The first was to Dr. Harold Finch, to tell him not to worry, that no apology was necessary, and that he understood these things happen. The second call was to his attorney. The following morning was a Sunday, and most of the Hargrove administration was not at work. Victoria Ashworth was, because she always came in the day after a major event to oversee cleanup and debrief with her team. She arrived at 7:30, parked in her usual spot, and let herself in through the side entrance, the same entrance where she had spoken to Walter Ellison the morning before. She had thought about the conversation a little more than she wanted to admit. Donaster. Finch's words had settled uncomfortably in her chest overnight, but she had managed to mostly rationalize around them. She hadn't known who he was. She had been doing her job. Anyone could claim to be anything. She couldn't be expected to recognize every donor who had ever given money to the school 20 years ago. It was an honest mistake. And honest mistakes had explanations. And explanations were not the same as apologies. By 10 o'clock that morning, 3 things happened in relatively quick succession. The first was that an email arrived in her inbox from the university's general counsel, requesting her presence in a meeting at 11. The second was that her assistant knocked on her office door and told her, with wide eyes, that there were 2 men in the lobby asking to speak with the director of operations. Men in suits who had arrived in a car that, in the assistant's words, looked like it cost more than this building. The third was that Victoria's phone rang, and the number on the screen was the private line of the university's Board of Trustees chair. She stared at the phone for 3 rings before she answered. Faça o próximo com 30,000 caracteres 3.06, Claude respondeu. The Board of Trustees chair's name was Margaret Osei, and she was not a woman who made unnecessary phone calls. The Board of Trustees chair's name was Margaret Osei, and she was not a woman who made unnecessary phone calls. In 11 years of working at Hargrove, Victoria had spoken to her exactly 4 times. Twice at formal university events, once during a budget review, and once when a catering mishap at a donor dinner had briefly threatened to become a public relations issue. Each of those conversations had been brief, professional, and slightly intimidating. This one began the same way. Good morning, Victoria. I'll be direct with you because I think that's the most respectful thing I can do. Are you available to come to the main conference room at 11? Victoria said she was. Good. I'd also ask that you not discuss the events of yesterday with any of your staff before that meeting. Not because you're in any kind of trouble. A pause that felt carefully constructed. But because we want to make sure everyone has complete information before any conversations happen. Does that make sense? Victoria said it did. She sat at her desk for a long moment after the call ended and looked at the framed photo she kept on the corner of it. Herself at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new student center, standing beside Dr. Finch, both of them smiling. She had been so proud of that event. She had organized every detail herself. She thought about Walter Ellison's face as he turned to leave, the absence of anger in it. She had thought at the time that it meant she had won the exchange. She understood now that it had meant something entirely different. The conference room on the 4th floor of the administration building had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the central quad. And on a clear May morning like this one, the view was genuinely beautiful. Students crossing the path below, the old oak trees casting long shadows across the lawn, the stone buildings catching the early light. Victoria had always loved that view. She had always felt, standing near those windows, that she belonged in a room like this one. There were 5 people already seated when she arrived at 5 minutes to 11. Margaret Osei at the head of the table. The university's general counsel, a quiet man named Dennis Park, beside her. Dr. Finch, who did not look at Victoria when she entered. 2 other members of the board she recognized by face, but not by name. And at the far end of the table, in a chair slightly apart from the others, Walter Ellison. He was wearing a different suit today. Navy blue, slightly less formal than the charcoal from the day before. His cane was leaning against the wall behind him. He was holding a cup of coffee in both hands and looking out the window at the quad below. And when Victoria walked in, he turned his head and looked at her with the same expression she had seen the day before. Calm, attentive, filing things away. Victoria sat down. She folded her hands on the table. She was good at composure. She had built a career partly on the ability to walk into difficult rooms and look like she belonged there. But the composure required more effort than usual this morning. Margaret Osei spoke first. She explained, with the measured neutrality of someone who has run many difficult meetings, that Mr. Ellison had contacted the board the previous evening regarding an experience he had at the graduation ceremony. She said the board took the treatment of all university guests seriously, and particularly took seriously any situation involving individuals with significant relationships to the institution. She said she wanted to give Victoria the opportunity to share her perspective before any decisions were made. Victoria shared her perspective. She was honest. She explained the guest list issue, the protocol she followed, the pressure of managing a large event, the fact that she had no way of knowing who Walter Ellison was. She did not make excuses, exactly, but she built a careful structure of context around what had happened, the way people do when they are hoping that context will function as absolution. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Walter Ellison set down his coffee cup and spoke for the first time. His voice was unhurried. It had the particular quality of someone who had learned, over many decades, that there was no situation that required him to rush his words. He said he appreciated Victoria's explanation. He said he had no doubt that she was genuinely good at her job. He said he understood the pressures of event management and didn't want to minimize them. "But I'd like to share something," he said, "if the room will allow me a few minutes." The room allowed him. He talked about Hargrove. Not the Hargrove that existed today, but the one that had existed in 2002, when he had first heard that it was in financial trouble. He had driven out to see it on a gray November afternoon, walked the campus alone, looked at the buildings and the empty classrooms and the notices on the bulletin boards for clubs and study groups and student events, and thought about what it would mean for all of those lives if the place simply ceased to exist. He talked about the months of negotiations that followed, the complexity of restructuring a failing academic institution, the compromises and the setbacks, and the moments when the whole thing nearly fell apart 3 or 4 times. He talked about a young woman named Carla Medeiros, who had been one of the first students to receive a scholarship from the fund he had created. She had grown up in a neighborhood 40 minutes from the campus, had been accepted to Hargrove on her academic merit, and had nearly had to decline because her family couldn't cover the gap between financial aid and actual tuition costs. The scholarship had covered that gap. Carla Medeiros had graduated, gone to medical school, and was now a pediatric cardiologist at a children's hospital in Philadelphia. He had a photograph of her white coat ceremony somewhere at home, he said. She had sent it to him with a handwritten note. "I'm not telling you this to impress anyone," Walter said. "I'm telling you because it's the reason I drove 2 hours yesterday to watch a graduation ceremony. Not because I wanted recognition. I gave up recognition a long time ago. I came because I like watching the end of the story. I like seeing the people who made it." He picked up his coffee again. What happened at the door was not the end of the world. I've had worse days, but it reminded me of something I've been meaning to address for a while, which is the culture of this administration. How people are treated when they arrive here. Whether the first thing a visitor experiences is warmth or a wall. And here is where I'll offer my second observation, because I think it's worth saying plainly. What Walter described is not unique to Hargrove. It is the quiet disease of institutions everywhere. The way that bureaucracy, over time, trains people to protect the system rather than serve the human being standing in front of them. Victoria wasn't a monster. She was a product of a culture that rewarded the appearance of control over the reality of kindness. That doesn't excuse what she said to Walter, but it explains why it happened, and why it keeps happening in lobbies and offices and check-in desks all over the world. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. By the end of it, several things had been decided. Victoria Ashworth was placed on administrative leave pending a full review of guest management protocols across all university events. This was framed carefully, not as a punishment, but as a procedural response. The kind of language that institutional HR departments are very good at generating. Victoria knew what it meant. She accepted it without argument, which took more self-control than almost anything she had done in her professional life. Walter Ellison announced that he would be taking a more active role in the university's governance going forward, something he had deliberately avoided for 2 decades, out of a desire to let the institution operate independently. He said recent conversations with Dr. Finch about the university's direction had convinced him that his involvement was warranted again. He said he intended to begin with a full review of administrative culture and guest services, and that he was commissioning an independent audit of the scholarship program to ensure it was reaching the students who most needed it. He also said, and this was the part that nobody in the room had expected, that he wanted to establish a new annual award. It would be given at each graduation ceremony to one member of the administrative or support staff who had demonstrated exceptional kindness towards students, families, and guests throughout the year. It would carry a meaningful financial prize and would be announced publicly at the ceremony. "Because," he said, "I think we celebrate the graduates, and we should. But we almost never celebrate the people who make them feel welcome when they arrive." Finch, who had been mostly quiet throughout the meeting, looked out the window and said nothing. But he was smiling. Victoria cleaned out the personal items from her office that afternoon. Not permanently. She was on leave, not terminated. and the review process would take weeks. But she wanted to take home the framed photo from the ribbon cutting and the small succulent she had been growing on the windowsill for 3 years, and a few other things that felt too personal to leave behind in a room she wasn't sure she'd return to in the same way. Priya, the young assistant who had gone to find Victoria at the check-in table the morning before, passed her in the hallway. She slowed down and looked like she wanted to say something. "I should have pushed back," Priya said quietly. "When I heard how you spoke to him, I should have said something." Victoria looked at her for a moment. "You were doing your job." "So were you," Priya said. "But we both know that wasn't just about the job." Victoria didn't answer. She carried her box out to her car, put it in the trunk, and sat in the driver's seat for a long time without starting the engine. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived on the desk of every member of the Hargrove administrative staff. It was brief. 1 page, on plain paper, without any university letterhead. It outlined a new set of guidelines for guest interaction that Walter Ellison had personally drafted with input from students, staff, and a group of hospitality consultants he had brought in from outside the institution. The guidelines were not complicated. They were not bureaucratic. They read, in tone, more like a letter from a grandfather than a policy document. The central principle was this: every person who arrives at this institution deserves to be treated as if they might be the most important person who has ever walked through our door. Not because they might be wealthy or powerful or connected, but because they are a human being who made the effort to come here. And that effort deserves to be honored. There was no mention of Victoria Ashworth in the letter. There was no mention of what had happened at graduation. Walter had specifically requested that the incident not be referenced, because he felt that using someone's mistake as a teaching tool was a form of humiliation in itself, and he had seen enough of that. The review concluded 6 weeks after graduation day. Victoria was reinstated, but not to her previous role. She was moved laterally, still within the events department, but no longer as director. The director position was filled by someone from within the team, a quieter woman named Judith, who had worked under Victoria for 7 years, and who, as it turned out, had a gift for the job that no one had ever bothered to look for because Victoria had always been standing in front of it. Victoria accepted the change without legal challenge and without drama. People who worked with her said she seemed different after that summer. Less interested in the clipboard and the headset. More interested in the actual humans moving through the events she helped organize. Whether that was genuine transformation or strategic adaptation, no one could say for certain. Probably it was some of both. People are complicated that way. The following May, at the graduation ceremony for the class of 2025, Walter Ellison sat in the 3rd row of the main hall. He had been on the official guest list since October. He wore a new suit, dark navy, well-fitted, and he left the cane at home this time. The ceremony proceeded in the usual way. And then, near the end, Margaret Osei took the podium and announced the first recipient of the Ellison Award for Distinguished Service to the Hargrove community. The winner was a security guard named Raymond Tull, who had worked the overnight shift at the campus library for 19 years and who, according to dozens of student nominations, had a habit of learning every student's name and asking about their thesis projects and leaving small notes of encouragement on the study room whiteboards during finals week. Raymond Tull walked to the podium in a jacket that was clearly borrowed and slightly too large, accepted the award with the overwhelmed expression of someone who has never been the center of attention in his life, and said, into the microphone, "I just like people. I don't know what else to say." The room gave him a standing ovation. Walter Ellison stood with everyone else. clapping with the unhurried steadiness of a man who had no reason to rush anything anymore, and looked at the faces around him. Students, families, faculty, staff, and felt something he hadn't felt the year before when he'd driven home alone on a Sunday afternoon. He felt like the story had ended the right way. There is a lesson here that does not require much decoration. The person you dismiss might be the person who built the floor you're standing on. But more than that, and this is the part that matters more, the person you dismiss is always a person. That should be enough. It was always enough. We just forget sometimes when we're holding a clipboard and wearing a headset and telling ourselves that we are the ones in charge. We are never as in charge as we think we are. And kindness, real kindness, the kind that costs something, the kind that makes you slow down when you're busy and look someone in the eye and treat them like they matter. That is not weakness. It is the most powerful thing one human being can offer another. Walter Ellison knew that. He had known it for a long time. He learned it, he once told Dr. Finch, from a woman who turned him away at a door 30 years before he ever bought a university. He never did find out what happened to her.